Hello, it's the Comics Kid 2099, and I am here for what I hope is my final video on my Batman collection. I'm going to try to make an effort to talk about each book a little less, and hopefully I can get through the rest of this collection for this video. The first books that I will be talking about here would be Batman Tenses, Volume 1 and 2. I will only pull out one of them. This is written by Joe Casey. He's a guy, I don't have a whole lot of his books, but I really respect the way he writes. He basically writes for himself, and he makes no apologies for it. In this book here, it's set early in Batman's career, and it's about Batman fighting a psychopath. There's more going on there, but I won't really spoil it. Plus, I'm talking very little about these. I will say, I'm not sure why DC hasn't collected both of these into one book. They're very short. See, I think it's like 60 pages per volume, and that'd make a decent, that'd make a normal size trade. I just don't know why they basically ignored it. It's one that I enjoyed, though, so if you can find both of those, I say go for it. Then here we've got the very, very early stuff from Grant Morrison's run, the first 2 volumes. And I've also got it sitting right next to the very early Paul Dini stuff, Detective and Death in the City. And then both of these runs crossed over with Robin and Nightwing in the Resurrection of Ra's al Ghul. Resurrection of Ra's al Ghul, if you haven't read it, don't. This story was such a waste of my time. It's disappointing how very little actually happens in this book, and how it's all what little does happen is just swept under the rug. So I think literally the next month after this crossover, the one big consequence was done with. It was ignored, essentially. So if you're wondering, oh, Paul Dini and Grant Morrison, no, it's not what you think. Just ignore this if you're looking for Batman books to get into. With these over here, I like Grant Morrison. I'm a big fan of his. These were interesting. With this one especially, Batman and Son, it was really jarring. You would go through a story arc that's introducing, Ninja Man-Bats and Batman's new son, and then out of nowhere, the story would just completely stop, and then you'd get a story about the Joker trying to kill all of his henchmen, and it was done in this weird prose with illustrations. And then it would go back to the storyline that you just stopped in the middle of. And it's really jarring to read that in trade, and probably it was really jarring to read in single issues too. And from what I understand, Morrison's recent run on Action Comics did something very similar with that. The Black Glove, I think it's a little bit more cohesive as a story. There's actually a couple of stories here, but the reason I don't have the rest of his run, I do have Batman R.I.P., but with Morrison, the way I see it, all of his stuff from the last 15 years seems to connect. You start with his JLA run, then you go to 7 Soldiers, then 52, which he wrote with 3 other authors, and then from there you need to read Batman R.I.P. and Final Crisis, as well as these books leading up to R.I.P., and then read the Batman and Robin and Batman Inc. and all that stuff that happens after R.I.P. I haven't read 52, so that's why I haven't yet read R.I.P. or Final Crisis. But I felt okay reading these because they don't explicitly tie in with 52. Paul Dini's run, if you don't know who that is, he worked on the animated series from the 1990s, and right here, these books are basically very evocative of his work on that animated series. It's mostly just 1- and 2-part stories, a lot of standalone issues, and mostly 2-part arcs. A lot of it feels a whole lot like the animated series, and that's probably because Paul Dini's working on it. And I think both of these are kind of hard to come by, but if you see them anywhere, do yourself a favor and pick these up. Even if you're not especially a fan of Batman, these are really good, and I think you'd enjoy them. Not to mention, if you like having rare antiquities of, comic books, then these, if you see them somewhere and they're kind of cheap, they're usually not as cheap online. These 2 books, Private Case Book and Heart of Hush, are also part of Dini's run, and I believe part of these to conclude his run on Detective Comics, and after this he went on to do something else. I don't remember what the other... He did more Batman work shortly after this, but this was these 4 titles and then the Resurrection of Ra's al Ghul. That was his run on Detective. And with Private Casebook, that was, again, a lot like Death in the City and Detective. It was mostly just standalone arcs, or standalone stories and 2-parters. Heart of Hush, I think, was his only arc in this run. And it was okay. It was definitely better than all the other Hush stories that I've read. It wasn't just terrific. I liked some of his the other books here in his run. Gotham After Midnight. This is done by Steve Niles. And if you have never heard of him, he did 30 Days of Night. And this story is basically Steve Niles' version of The Long Halloween. It's a mystery that Batman is trying to solve. He's doing it over the course of an entire year, and it introduces a new villain, just like Long Halloween did. And where Long Halloween was actually really hard to tell who the villain was, even up until it's apparently solved, this really, well, it kind of was, but the closer you get, the easier it was to tell. I'm going to have to say, if you're curious about this, don't bother. There's 1 or 2 elements of this story that I kind of liked, but it's a 12-issue storyline, and 1 or 2 things that I liked out of that whole thing, that's not really terrific. Nothing to write home about. I may do a video on it someday. Oh boy. Okay. We have here Wardrums, and then the 3-part War Games. I really hated War Games. Wardrums is okay. It's following up on what was going on in Robin around that time, which, if I had to assume, I'm thinking that, see, Jack Drake, Tim Drake's father, found out that Tim was Robin, and he basically forced him to quit. And if I had to make a guess, I would say that that was editorially driven so that Wardrums could happen. And Wardrums is basically where Stephanie Brown becomes the new Robin. And then at the, not to spoil anything, but the story's kind of old, at the end of the story, Stephanie Brown is fired, but she does one thing. She steals a war game scenario from Batman's computer, where apparently Batman had this plan to, if things got really bad in Gotham, he was going to unite all of the gangs under one leader that he had installed in the city. And then basically he would control all the gangs, and I assume if his plan had worked, then he would slowly bring crime down that way. I'm not exactly sure if he had this plan. Why didn't he just do it? It seems like something you could at least try. Instead, it seems like he had this plan just sitting there, and it could have worked if he had actually done it. But instead, Stephanie Brown tried to institute it, and, well, I won't spoil why, but there's one big element of the plan missing when she tries to do it. And so, literally for 3 books, all you see is gang warfare, and each member of the Bat family trying to deal with it. Nothing happens until the very end of the book, and I just feel like it definitely could have all been done in one trade. It did not have to be 3 books long, and even then, it's just boring. Nothing really interesting happens here. I don't even know how long the effects of this lasted, and if you haven't read it, I guess I won't tell you what the effects are, but I'm telling you, if you haven't read it, don't bother. This is just kind of bad. And there is a follow-up called War Crimes, which I haven't read. I'm kind of scared to, because it calls back to something really dumb that, well, it makes something that happened here even worse. This is kind of fun. It's got some work here by Paul Dini, who I've already talked about, and Bruce Timm, his partner in crime, who his art style is what you see right here, on also from the Batman animated series. And this is, I think, a 3-issue miniseries that just kind of, Harley and Ivy escape from Arkham, hilarity ensues. Need I say more? And then I think there's actually a short story by Dan Brereton, who, if I had to be honest, I don't like Dan Brereton's art. But this is fun. And it's one that, it's not going to change hearts and minds, but if you like Harley Quinn, if you like Poison Ivy, if you like good, solid Batman stories, get Harley and Ivy. These two books here are both part of, see there's 1 and 2, both part of the post-Batman No Man's Land status quo, which I have not read Batman No Man's Land. It is, as we speak, being collected in these really big volumes that are like, you know, the size of 2 of these, and that's 1 volume. And I've got 2 or 3 of them right now. And so I'm waiting for all of that whole event to be collected before I start reading it. And right now, I don't have it all. So these 2 books happened immediately after No Man's Land, and it's basically just showing that Gotham is a different place. Now, this one, Evolution, I actually really enjoyed. It's got a couple of stories in it. The art style, I'm going to slow down this video a little bit and show you some of the art. Let me see if I can do this. It's like this. There's, like, this page here is just lots, it's black and white and then red. And then, like, this one right here is, like, black and white and mostly brown for that issue. And then, I can't seem to find one right now, but there's one issue here where it's black and white and mostly green. And that art style just really intrigued me. And the art style itself, aside from the coloring, is just really good in my opinion. And also, it's just a kind of interesting story. It's got Ra's al Ghul in it. If you like Ra's, I'd recommend reading this. And it's just kind of an interesting ideas going on here. I like it, but I've also heard someone say, if you've read No Man's Land, that these stories don't hold up. And it could be that I like this story because I haven't read No Man's Land. Officer Down, that's actually a crossover. It's got Catwoman, Robin, Nightwing, Batgirl. It was crossing over basically all of the Bat titles. And it was okay, but it was not really my cup of tea. It could just be that I read it immediately after Evolution, where the art here is much more standard than Evolution, where Evolution kind of did a lot of interesting things with the art. Officer Down really didn't. And it was just the story seemed to, there's one thing that happens in the story basically. And once you know what that thing is, I won't tell you what it is. Once you know what it is, there's really no reason to read this in my opinion. Maybe I need to go back and reread it, see if there's something there that I missed, but I didn't much care for it. I have The Man Who Laughs. I've talked about this in a couple of my, isn't that so creepy? I've talked about this in some of my other collection videos of Batman. This is my favorite Joker origin story of the 2 that I have read. And it's written by Ed Brubaker, who you may recognize from his like 8 years on Captain America. And it's really, it's just a solid Joker story. Not much more to say beyond that. If you haven't read it, I would recommend doing so. And it's actually, it collects a couple of issues from, I want to say Gotham Central, maybe not. It's a team-up story with the Golden Age Green Lantern. And it's also a good story written by Brubaker, but it has nothing to do with the Joker. This one here, very similar to Tales of the Demon and Scarecrow Tales. This is just a collection of Riddler and Two-Face stories. As you might could guess, this was put out because of Batman Forever. It's got a foreword by Mark Hamill. It doesn't even say that on the cover, I don't think. No, yeah, over there. You can barely see it. And he kind of has some interesting insights into Batman. But this, it's got actually a couple of really interesting stories. One, I think 2 of them are post-crisis sort of origin stories for Two-Face. The Two-Face story predates Long Halloween and is, in my opinion, better than Long Halloween. And then the Riddler story is a very interesting take on the Riddler that sadly I don't think has been revisited since this story. And I believe it was written by Neil Gaiman, of all people. So if you like those 2 characters and you just want to see some historical stories with them, or some newer stories that are really good in my opinion, I'd say pick that up. Four of a Kind, this, as near as I can tell, all 4 of these characters, Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, Riddler, and you can't see him, but Man-Bat, they all appeared in Batman's first year, in between the issues. I'm not sure if I like that idea. I kind of prefer the idea that Catwoman and Joker were the first two supervillains, and that everyone else came after those two. But this is 4 annuals that were happening all in the same year, and all of them had year 1 branded on their covers. And it's some of them, since it's 4 separate stories that are written by different people, basically this is a mixed bag. Some of them are okay, some of them are really not. And if you like those characters, that also plays into whether or not you should get this. Then we have Going Sane, which is, it's okay. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's the Joker, and as the title suggests, he basically, where other people, if they do something that really kind of traumatic, it shocks them into insanity, sort of. The Joker does something that really shocks him, and he goes sane for a little while. And of course, you know that doesn't last. It's kind of interesting getting into the Joker's head, but it seems really goofy that the Joker could be broken, and when you break something that's already broken, it fixes it. That's just kind of a silly concept. And I know sometimes comic books need to be a little silly, but that's, to me, is pushing it. And we have Strange Apparitions. I think I paid like $25 for this trade. I won't usually pay much more than that, but I got this, and I talked in an earlier video about Dark Detective, which was written by Steve Englehart, and this is the man. This run, I think it's about 7 or 8 issues long. It doesn't look like it's a very long trade. Is fantastic. This whole run, it's a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that Frank Miller is who made Batman cool. And granted, in the 1960s, Batman was goofy, he was silly, there was a lot of camp involved, and some people seem to think that we went immediately from Adam West to Frank Miller, and that's just not true. Denny O'Neil did a lot to make Batman darker in the 1970s, and also Steve Englehart here. This run takes place in the 70s, and it's much darker than Adam West, so if you're into dark, I'd say if you can find this, give it a look. But also, it has elements of silliness in it. Like, Batman is still very much answerable to the city, so when they say something like they're thinking about arresting him or something like that, he takes it seriously. And if you've watched or read modern Batman, he values justice over the law, and he's willing to spit in the face of the law if it means preserving justice. But that story, it's got a really interesting Joker story that stood the test of time. I think it was adapted into the animated series. And it's got the Hugo Strange. I think his first appearance in like 40 years. Hugo Strange had appeared in the 1940s, and then for that long he didn't show up again, and then was reused here in Strange Apparitions. Also, this run is where the modern version of Deadshot makes his first appearance. He was also a character who appeared in like the 1940s, and then for 30 years he didn't show up again, and then Englehart and Rogers, they revamped him and gave us the version that you all know and love today. Now this story, not a very well-known story, Joker's head is shaved. It's called Joker, the Devil's Advocate. And this, as I recall, there's a series of murders happening. The Joker is blamed for it. I don't want to spoil it, but it's not the Joker who's doing it. And so it's one of those things where the Batman, he knows that it would be wrong to kill the Joker for a crime that he didn't commit. Even though the Joker has killed hundreds and hundreds of people, he didn't commit these crimes, and that is why Batman feels like he has to put a stop to the Joker being executed. And I won't talk much more about it. That's another one that you might not be able to find. It's kind of a rare book. I just happened to spot in a bookstore once. But if you find it, I would recommend getting it. There are a few Joker stories that I really like, and that's one of them. False Faces. This is one of those books. There's not much to write home about here. It's just a series of unrelated stories by Brian K. Vaughan. And basically the only reason this is collected is because it's by Brian K. Vaughan. These stories are not to the caliber of books like Why the Last Man or anything else written by Vaughan. It's just a whole bunch of very short, not really huge stories, just kind of, some of them don't even involve Batman. I think there's a couple Wonder Woman comics in there, which was strange, I thought. Batman, Death and the Maidens. This, I think, was a 9-issue miniseries, and this was a really interesting book, I thought. It reveals that Ra's al Ghul has another daughter. I know I'm spoiling that, but if I want you to read it, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of spoilers, right? And basically this shows a lot of her life and how it was just a really terrible life. And this book, in theory, should have been a game changer for the Batman books. But instead, as soon as this was over, it was like nobody even referenced this book again. It was really sad that this book didn't have as big of an impact as it should have had. Now, you may not be able to tell, but that is Batman Terror. And I got this, I think, for $10. It's in the plastic bag because it's one of those books that's kind of hard to find. Now, if you find Batman Prey at like your Books A Million or your local comic book store, it collects the storyline Prey, and then it collects Terror, which was done like 10 years later. But they're both, like, Terror is a loose sequel to Prey. I have not read Prey. I probably should get around to that now that it's back in print, but I'm just not happy that Terror is collected inside because I already have Terror, and I don't really need it again in another book. But at the same time, I don't want to get rid of this book because I have a feeling it's still kind of hard to find by itself. Back there, I'm not going to pull them out. We have Batman Death Mask, and that is a manga, and it's manga-sized. And it deals with Batman kind of having to revisit his days of training. And it's a very interesting book. If you like Batman Begins, which also deals with his training, you should probably read that. And if you like manga, or if you're curious to see Batman done in the manga style, I talked about a couple of other books in this collection that are done in that style. This would be the one that it's probably the most manga-ish. And then also Untold Legends of the Batman. This version of this comic is actually in black and white. It's a digest size. I know I've seen copies of this in color online and stuff, but this one is in black and white. And basically, this was done in the 1970s, and it was sort of a way to grab all of the Batman's seemingly contradictory origin elements and combine them into one story. And the story is admittedly kind of weak, but seeing all of these elements that were later undone by Crisis on Infinite Earths, some of them are really interesting. I will give it that. And if you like Batman, older Batman stories, I would recommend seeking this out.